Welcome to those out in the computer land that are watching this on the internet. We're in Mark 14, 27-52, says it right here. All right. We're going to do 27 and 28 verses. All right. Then Jesus said to them, so it's Jesus talking, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. All right, let me unpack this a little bit. The predictions recorded here were spoken by Jesus as he walked with the disciples from the upper room to the Mount of Olives. Here it seems to be defined by the words from Zechariah. So it means not that the disciples will lose their faith in Jesus, but their courage will fail and they will forsake and give up on Jesus. When the shepherd, Jesus, is struck, the sheep, the disciples, will be scattered. The quotation is from Zechariah 13:7 and clearly indicates that the death of Jesus is a result of the action from God, and that its results will end in the scattering of the sheep. The prophecy was fulfilled. His disciples were afraid to be identified with Jesus at his trial and at his death, and that caused them to forsake him. And this was so true of Peter, whose actions are often the model of the rest of the disciples. Okay, where it says, I will go before you into Galilee. The place for the rendezvous with the disciples after the resurrection was in the province of Galilee. I think that they may have heard it, but it just didn't click. They went in, but they weren't comprehending what he was saying. It was a promise to the disciples, and they could use it to verify of his resurrection. These instructions were also repeated to the women at the tomb to tell the disciples, and we find that in Matthew 28:10. And the disciples did indeed go to Galilee, into a mountain where Jesus had appointed them, and we find that in Matthew 28:16. This announcement was to be a great encouragement to the disciples about his resurrection. They heard it, but they weren't quite getting it. We're going to meet Jesus where? Come back from the dead? But wait, there's more. They just didn't understand it. All right, verse 29 and 30. Peter said to him, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. Jesus said to him, assuredly I say to you that day, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Ouch. The prediction about the unfaithfulness of the disciples was not well received. In scorning the predictions of Christ about their disloyalty, they argued with the Lord about being loyal. Peter especially was scoffed, and he scoffed at this future thing that he boasted he would never forsake Christ. I'll never forsake you, Lord. Never. Oh, but, what was that?
Never say never.
Never say never, yeah. But he forsake Christ. Jesus responded to Peter's boast with a detailed forecast of Peter's 3 denials of Christ before the rooster crowed twice. When Peter heard that second crow of the rooster, it must have been like a train whistle screaming in his ears. When that rooster did that, can you imagine how his heart must have dropped? What he felt like. We can't really feel what he felt like, but wow, he denied Christ. Christ said it was going to happen, and it happened. What he felt, we can't even fathom what Peter felt. The shame, the disloyalty. You name it, he felt it at that point in time. And the realization of Jesus' words, they hit home at that point. Jesus, what did I just do? What did I do? We can only imagine. We can only imagine. Verses 31 and 32. But he spoke more vehemently, if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said likewise. Then they came to a place which is named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And that kind of looks like what Gethsemane was. The name Gethsemane is probably from the Hebrew word Gatsami, press of oils, where they have a lot of olive gardens. It was a garden located somewhere on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, in which there were olive trees and olive presses. It was one of Jesus' favorite spots. And we know that because Luke 22:39 and John 18:2 tell us. No doubt often used by Jesus and his disciples as a place to be alone. Here he faced one of his most crucial tests. Verses 33 and 34. And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch. Leaving the rest of the disciples behind, Jesus took with him the three of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. He must have felt his need for their presence in this time of crisis. All right, so the two verbs translated deeply distressed and troubled together describe an extremely acute emotion. A compound of bewilderment, maybe fear, uncertainty, and anxiety, nowhere else portrayed in such a vivid term as here. The deep agony Jesus shared with his disciples. Why? Probably because he wanted them to know something of the depths of suffering he is about to experience for the redemption of the world. Then, Jesus, having shared his feelings with Peter, James, and John, withdrew to be alone with his Father. Jesus commanded them to keep watch, meant either that they were to stay awake and so share in his agony and passion, or they were there to be on the lookout for those Jesus knew were on their way to arrest him. John 18:2 tells us that Judas knew the place where Jesus liked to go and pray, and it was Gethsemane in the Olive Gardens. Excuse me. Verses 35 and 36. He went a little farther and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Jesus was the Lamb of God, bearing the penalty of sins of all mankind. He wasn't a mere martyr. The wrath of God was turned loose on him for us. Only this can adequately explain what happened in Gethsemane. The burden and agony was so great that he fell on the ground. His prayer, uttered in a face-down position, was addressed, Abba, Father. The word Abba is Aramaic and means an intimate form for father or daddy. A word the Jews did not use to address God because they thought it was disrespectful. Since Jesus was the unique Son of God and on the most intimate terms, with him. It was natural for him to use it. Jesus believed that with God anything was possible, and therefore prayed for the cup to be removed from him. This cup is the same one Jesus referred to in Mark 10:38 and 39, the cup of wrath of God. In the Old Testament, it is regularly used as a metaphor of punishment and judgment. Here, it obviously refers to Jesus' death. Jesus desired, and his desire was, for the removal of the cup. But he willingly placed his will in submission to his Father's will. He obeyed his Father. Verses 37 and 38. Then he came and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Couldn't even watch an hour, and they had fallen asleep. Returning to his disciples, Jesus found them sleeping. They were no doubt very tired. The hour was late, probably sometime past midnight, we're assuming, and they had experienced some excitement during the day. Nevertheless, it was a critical time, and they were expected to be awake. Jesus' rebuke in verse 37 is addressed to Peter, whereas in verse 38, it would seem Jesus addressing all three. Peter's probably singled out because he was the one who had boasted of his devotion to Jesus. He who had said he was willing to die if need be. With Christ, could not only watch for an hour, couldn't stay awake. And don't get boastful yourself, because if any of us were there, we probably would all been asleep too. Snoring away, sleeping like newborn babies, right beside Peter. Verses 39 and 40. Again, he went away and prayed, and spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know how to answer him. Okay, again, after having left his disciples to pray, Jesus returned to find them asleep. Because of sheer fatigue, they were unable to stay awake. The disciples were so ashamed at being caught asleep a second time, they knew not what to say in answer of his reproof. Even Peter had nothing to say this time. He didn't mumble a word. So, now we're counting. Now this is the second time Jesus found them asleep. The second time. You know, when I was in the military, it was simple. If you're nodding off, if you're asleep, you stand up. You get up, you go to the back of the room, you stand there standing so you don't fall asleep. They could have used that little hint here. Verses 41. I didn't, the New King James is okay, but I'm going to read you guys also the King James so you get the original version of this also. Okay, it says, verse 41. Then he came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Now here's the King James Version. And he cometh the third time and saith unto them, sleep on now, and take your rest. It is enough. The hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Okay, breaking this down a little. Sleep on now has the meaning of, as far as you need to watch with me, as far as you need to watch with me is concerned, that is over. Go ahead and sleep. It is now clear to Jesus that it is God's will for him to go to the cross. The cup will not be taken from him. Jesus is going to go to the cross for all of us. However, their peaceful slumber only lasted for a moment. The traitor with the armed men, the lanterns, and the torches was coming. Verse 42. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. The disciples apparently were still lying on the ground. So when Jesus heard the approach of the arresting party, he told the disciples to get on their feet. Verse 43. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and scribes and the elders. The arresting party, fully armed, was made of the temple guards and a detachment of soldiers sent by Pilate. Because remember, they couldn't do anything unless they had Pilate's permission. This was not a motley crew, as it was talked about in John's Gospel, but it is consistent of a detachment of soldiers and some official attendants of the Sanhedrin. We find that in John 18:3. And they came armed with swords and clubs. Apparently, they thought they would meet with resistance. The presence of the priests and the guards indicates that it was not on Passover, because it was forbidden to bear arms on such a day. John added the detail that they carried lanterns and torches. Judas was one of the 12. Another possibility that one of the 12 is repeated is to keep the tragic element of the situation before us. He was a betrayer. It was Judas, and he was one of the official 12. What a sad thought. Verses 44 through 46. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whoever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. The prearranged signal, or means of identifying Jesus, was for Judas to kiss him. What a despicable way to give away Jesus. Those are my words. Horrible. This suggests that the members of the arresting party did not know Jesus. They had no clue who he was. Or perhaps since it was dark, they wanted to be sure they arrested the correct person. In their custom, rabbis were greeted by their disciples with a kiss. So Judas, in doing this act, would not be suspected for what it really was. Judas' instructions to the crowd were designed to assure a successful and accomplishment of the correct task in arresting him. They were to lead Jesus away securely, with no chance of escape, and to do it safely. Once being committed to his atrocity, Judas wanted it to go smoothly. He wanted it done, and that was it. Verse 47. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Mark doesn't say who wielded the sword, but we know from John that it was Peter, and that the ear belonged to Malchus, a servant of the high priest. And some of you may be old enough to remember Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. Let me go into a little detail on this. Apparently, Peter aimed at his head, but Malchus sidestepped and Peter only caught his ear. Jesus rebuked Peter in Matthew 26:52. And the restoration of the ear in Luke 22:51 are not recorded in Mark. Perhaps only the lobe was cut off. This would explain Luke's statement that Jesus healed the ear instead of replacing it in Luke 22:51, or perhaps the whole ear. So, when we get to meet Peter in person, ask him to recount the story. So when we're in heaven, yo, Peter, did you just lop off a little piece of the ear, or did you chop the whole thing off? Brother, I want to know, tell me. And see what he tells you. And if I'm not up there yet, send something down to me and let me know. Because if I'm up there, well, I can't communicate, so we won't be able to communicate. But once you get up there, just ask him. Say, yo, Peter, bro, what'd you do? You know, just ask him, see what he says. Be kind of interesting to know. But that's the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. All right, verses 48 through 50. Then Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then they all forsook him and fled. Jesus protested against the manner of his arrest. The crowd sent from the Sanhedrin had come after him with swords and clubs, as if he were a dangerous criminal, an insurrectionist of some kind. He had been teaching every day in the temple courts. We find that in verse 49. They could have arrested him there. Why then had they come at night? And why had they chosen to arrest him outside of the city? The obvious answer is they feared the people's reaction. They didn't want a mob going. They didn't want to incite a riot. So they secretly arrested Jesus. So they carefully chose both the time and the place, so there wouldn't be a ton of people around. The disciples, true to the Lord's prophecy, and perhaps totally bewildered by the complexity of the events which they at that time only partially understood, forsook him and fled. They jetted. They left the scene. We're out of here. This action on their part was probably necessary for the preservation of their own lives. They saw what was going on with Jesus, and he was their leader. What was going to happen to them? Because there is every reason to believe that the religious leaders of that time would have more than likely had arrested them and the whole group. They would have took everybody. We got their leader. Why don't we just grab them? We're here. They'll be happy. So they preserved themselves. Verses 51 and 52. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid a hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Now, only Mark records this mysterious episode. The young man is not identified, but the consensus is that it's Mark. They believe it's Mark. A lot of people smarter than I, studying the Bible a lot longer than I, they believe it's Mark. Why else would he insert such a trivial detail in this solemn story? Was this Mark's way of saying, hey, I was there? Why he was there is not explained. Ordinarily, but here's a little backstory. Ordinarily, men wore an undergarment called a chiton. This young man only had on his sindon, an outer garment. Usually, this garment was made of wool. However, this one was made of linen, an expensive material only worn by the rich. Since he had no chiton when he fled without his sindon, he was actually naked. Perhaps the main point of the story, and the reason Mark included it, was to show that the forsakenness of Jesus was total. Even his youth forsook him. So he had nothing. And we know Mark had some money. So normal people back that time, their undergarments were made of wool. Mark had money, so he had the ability to have a linen one. So that's why they're thinking that this was Mark when he fled. And they tried to lay a hold of him, and they wanted to catch him. But they didn't, and he got away. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the story for today.
We gotta continue, Pastor.
Next week is Pastor John, and I think he has something else he wants to talk about next week. So, thank you for joining us today. I get straight to the point. Hope you understood. Other than that, have a great day. Take care and God bless.